Everybody, welcome to Drive Through Review 744. Today we're going to talk about Ascension Tactics. This is just coming out now from Ultra Pro Entertainment, designed by Justin Gary and a lot of the other folks that worked on the original Ascension game. Now the original Ascension game was a deck building game, came out I think 10 or 11 years ago now. And it was one of the first deck building games that came out right after Dominion. And this, of course, is Ascension Tactics, which is a miniatures deck building game. So the deck building part of it is a lot like Ascension. Like, it's almost identical because you get runes, which you use to buy new cards to add to your deck, and you get power, which in the original you use to sort of smash monsters and cultists to get points, victory points. In this, you use the power to activate characters, and you will move them around the board, this hex map, and there's a lot of scenarios. There's like 12 or more scenarios, so it's a little bit tricky how to explain how many scenarios there are, which I'll talk about in a second, but you can play through different scenarios. You can play 1, 2, 3, and 4 player, and there are miniatures with it. Now this is the Kickstarter edition, which actually has full-blown plastic miniatures. There's going to be a retail edition, so instead of miniatures, it's going to be little standees that you can move around. Obviously, the retail edition is going to go for quite a bit cheaper than the Kickstarter edition did. But if you really want the miniatures, if you take a look at this video and you go, God, I really want that, but I also really want miniatures, they have said 100%, I think, maybe 99%. They are going to do another Kickstarter, I think in the somewhat near future. So if you want to go after that, or if you want to save up your money and use the standees, then you can go for that. So I'll show you a little bit of both because I have the components for both. The components for both come in the Kickstarter version. But let's jump down to the table. I'll tell you how it works, and then I'll come back and tell you my thoughts. Okay, here you can see everything kind of set up and sort of at the end of a game that I just played the other day. And you can see here some of the different miniatures here. So let's take a look at some of these. So here you have a Tyrannix miniature. This is kind of a robotic dragon. You've got Rut here, which kind of looks like Groot. He's sort of a tree guy. I do want to paint these. I just need to have the time. I set a bunch of miniatures off over the side over there. And I just wanted to give you kind of a quick scan of some of these. One of the things I want to say about the miniatures in this game is the sculpts are very unique. They're very full of character. And there's a lot of different miniatures in this game, so there's not a lot of repeated miniatures. There's only one kind of really repeated miniature, and that's the miniature for the cultist. And this is just some of them. So if we pop over here, you can see there's inserts that will go in here in this top part of the box here. And so you can just easily leave the box open and pull some of these trays out. So as possibly you get some of these new characters and heroes into the game, these are called champions, then you can get easy access to these. Or if you're going to set up another game after you play your first, you can find these pretty easily. And on the back of the scenario book is kind of a little map of these. So you'll start to learn pretty quickly like who's what and kind of which miniature matches which character and so on. But anyway, so you get a scenario book there. Of course, you get a rule book here as well. And of course, you got your cards and all that stuff. Now you do also get these tokens here. And this is actually, I'm not a big fan of these, I'll be honest with you, because they are all these square tokens. I like the art on them. So here's the Raven Siren, but every single champion miniature is just a square. And so here you've got Cetra and so on. And the art's cool. Personally, I would have liked to have sort of uniquely carved cardboard, so it could be in different shapes, not just all squares. But again, if you want to get into this and you're just really into it for the gameplay, then this will be at a discount. I don't know what the retail is versus the Kickstarter, but it's definitely significantly cheaper. But again, I do kind of am not really a big fan of just these squares. I wish they were like different shapes. And maybe, you could have cardboard punch outs of those that kind of matched, the overall shape here of some of these miniatures. Maybe you could have like a bigger one for that and stuff, and still put them in the standees and stuff like that. That's my only real kind of component gripe with the game, are those standees. Now, it doesn't really matter to me because I got the Kickstarter one. And so these miniatures, though, I think are fantastic. They're really great. So if we look at the board here, now I have this mat on top of here. And just because I like to use it, and the mat's nice because it keeps these from sliding around. They don't really slide around that much on the board. But if you look under the board there is a blank board that has the same hexes here, and you will take and put these little tokens and tiles on there to kind of build up the terrain. It's actually a double-sided board, so that on one side of the board is a pre-printed kind of starter scenario. So, and that's your first scenario that's in the book here. So it's kind of nice. So your first game, you don't have to spend a lot of time setting out these tokens here. You can just set up the side of the board and just go from there. So that's a cool kind of feature there. And again, this playmat here is an extra thing. It's not really necessary. It's just kind of a nice to have thing. But the board will come double-sided in the retail edition as well. So let's talk a little bit now about the gameplay. And of course, like I said, you're going to be using runes to buy cards here out of this kind of center row off to the side here. And similar to Ascension, there's always a stack of mystics that you can buy, a stack of heavy infantry that you can purchase as well. And that will upgrade your starting deck, which comes with the Apprentice and Militia, the exact same starting deck as Ascension. And of course, you can buy and add new cards to your deck. There'll be constructs and heroes and things like that. You're typically going to start with 4 champions that you can activate and put out onto the board. And if we look here, you can see there are gates here. So this particular scenario, there's a blue gate, and then at the top here, there was a yellow gate. So the blue player, when they deploy and summon their characters, they're going to come out of this gate and move around, and they're going to try to get to different objectives, interacting with some of these terrain pieces here. You can see there's trees, and then these kind of like force field things there. And then there's little treasure tokens that will be out on the board as well. And so the objectives are going to be different from scenario to scenario. So you might try to just hold these objectives, or these objectives might do other things. The rules for these little kind of force field things will change up. There may be kind of terrain that does damage to you. You might be able to interact with the terrain and destroy it and stuff. There might be little tokens that you maneuver around the board and stuff like that, based all on the scenario. So the way that you win is going to change up relatively significantly from scenario to scenario. So if we look here at the bottom of the board, these are just the 4 champions that I had for this last game here, and you can see the miniatures that go with them. And there are corresponding cards. So this Unbound Emissary here, if I can grab it right, there's a few things you can see. So it is an Enlightened champion, has 4 attack. It costs 2 power points to activate her. So you need to spend those power points to be able to move her and attack with her. She's got 5 defense, and of course she has a special rule here. Now Root here, or Root, is a Lifebound champion, 5 attack, also 2 to activate, 4 defense, some special rules. And you can see these are all the same 4 factions that you saw in the base Ascension game. Here's Tyrannix, this is the big dragon. You can see he's got a little bit more attack and defense, but he also costs you more points to activate. So on your turn, you're always going to get 2 power points to activate, and every player gets this little gateway card. So here's the blue player. So once per turn, you gain your 2 power points. And then as you spend these other cards, you're going to get extra runes here and extra power to activate different things. Now, one thing you can do is, if we look up here, of course you can spend some of your runes to upgrade to the mystics and the heavy infantry, which I showed you. But everybody has access to basically 4 cultists, and you can activate a cultist and put them on your team for 2 power. And the game comes with these little rings here for the cultists, and then in the base game for the retail game there's standees for these as well, and you put your little colored rings on there, and then you can always move these guys around. These guys really do nothing. You can't equip them with any constructs, and they basically do 2 attack, have 1 defense, but they can go out and hold objectives and kind of screen off from some of the other monsters from moving around. They can kind of block off choke points and stuff like that. So each player can get access to 4 of these. And then along the side of the board here, of course, you can see their quote-unquote center row, and these you can buy. So here's the cost. So I can buy this Vine Weaver. I'll pay 3 runes for it and put it in my deck, and then once it comes back out in my deck, like any deck building game, you can use it. And here's an ability to draw a card, and if it's a Lifebound Allegiance, so if I played another Lifebound card that turn, then I can gain additional 2 points. A lot of the cards also have this ambush, and when you buy ambushes, when you buy the card, you will trigger that ambush effect. So in this case, you may destroy an enemy construct. Now you also have here constructs right here, like this one. And so when you buy this, it'll go into your deck, and then when it comes back out, you can play it and then attach it to one of your champions. So if I wanted to attach it here to the Unbound Emissary, you can see it will add +2 to her attack and +3 to her defense. And there'll be other abilities and stuff that'll make them move quicker, or other special abilities and stuff like that you can attach them with the constructs. So they might go on there attached like that. And of course, whenever you buy a card, a new one will come out. The other thing you can get here is you can actually get new champions. So here's a Void champion. You can see he costs 7. And when you get him, then you will go find his miniature or standee, and then you can put him into play and you can activate him just like you can any other champion. And there are also monster champions that instead of spending runes for, you can spend power to kind of like defeat them and subdue them, and then you will get this card for them and then be able to activate them as well, just like any other champion. So let's talk about what happens when you activate champions. Well, let's say we had 4 power here, enough to activate Tyrannix, and he's off the board. So when you activate them, they're going to pop onto their gate. And by default, all of the champions have 3 movements. So I can move him 1, 2, 3 over to here. If you move into Force, that costs you 2 movement points. So I could go 1, 2, 3. And then Force also will block line of sight. So if he was hidden behind this, and there was another champion, let's say up there, and she had a ranged attack, she could try to shoot him through there, but the Force would block that. And there's some other basic rules for lines of sight based on the hex edges and stuff like this. So if they were here and here, then she would have line of sight because it would just go by a hex edge right there. So by default though, you get the 3 movement. You can get boosts and things like that to get extra movement. And then if you do combat, let's say we're just doing melee combat here, we can take a look at Tyrannix here. He's got 8 attack, and that is knock a black blade, and she has 5 defense. So it would just be most of the time it'd be pretty straightforward. So we got that, that's enough to defeat her. She will come off the board, and then what happens is that will exhaust her. And so at the end of your opponent's next turn, then this will unexhaust. So basically you've knocked her out for a whole turn. Her opponent will have to take a full turn, then she'll unexhaust. Now when you activate a champion on your turn, so let's say we just activated Tyrannix, he's going to exhaust, and then again at the end of your turn, he will unexhaust. So he'll be able to activate on the following turn. Now there are ranged attacks. Everything has a range of 3. So if Tyrannix was equipped maybe with a construct, they gave him ranged attack because he doesn't have it by default. He could attack her there. There's area attacks and stuff like that you can do. Now a lot of times the combat is not going to be so deterministic because of this thing called treasure tokens. So each scenario setup will tell you to put out a certain number of those treasure tokens there out on the board. If your characters move over them, they can pick them up by stopping on them. So here's some examples. So when you get a treasure token, you're going to keep it face down. You're not going to show your opponent. But at any time on your turn, or even on your opponent's turn, you can reveal that. So if I can do that when I activate a champion and start to move, then I can activate that and get 2 extra movement. Or maybe you attack me thinking you have enough to kill me, but then I can flip that up and get, oh, I got +2 defense, so I kind of block the attack. Some other things here, this one will add to your move and to your attack. This symbol here is a fight back. And so what happens is when you get hit, then you can fight them back. And if you do that, you can actually simultaneously damage each other. And some constructs will give you that fight back ability. Some of the characters have that fight back ability. Sometimes you'll get abilities that will allow you to trigger something when you do slay a monster or another character, another champion. So that will trigger on that. And sometimes you will get things that will tell you to pull treasure tokens out of this bag, because you definitely don't seed every treasure onto the board. So you can go and fish for treasure out of those bags. So that's really what you're doing in the game. You're drawing up to 5 cards, you're buying new cards, activating champions, moving them out, either trying to just knock the opponent out, control objectives, maybe move to certain kind of key areas on the board based on the scenario, and trying to be smart about your deck building so that you can build some combos together, some combos that go along with your different champions. And just a couple other things to show you before we jump over to the review. There are a few other decks of cards here. So the game does play solo, and you have this deck here, and you can kind of see, now these are sleeved, but you see these have a red back here. And it might be hard to see on camera, but you can see the red back there. And here is the villain deck. And so this, you'll take your turn in the solo game, and then you'll flip this up for the villain turn. So you flip 2 of these cards, and kind of depending on the scenario though, and where things are kind of at in the game, this deck kind of scales up a little bit as the game kind of moves on, which I'll talk about in a minute. But you're always using this deck here. Now there is a kind of sizable campaign actually, and based on the faction that you choose to play through the campaign, so if you're playing with Enlightened, you can get these special ability cards. Like here's the Void cards, and that must be the Construct cards, Mechana, and these are the Lifebound cards. So you can get upgrades to basically your whole team. And when you draw a card, you get to choose kind of which side it is. So you get some choices that you can add to your upgrades, and you can apply them either to like you as a whole team, or maybe to specific champions and stuff like that. And then instead of the champion cards that you see down here, the villain champions have kind of two sides to them. So you can see these have a black border here, and when you feel like playing in difficulty mode, you can flip them over to the gray border. They have kind of like upgraded abilities and stats. So you're always using the abilities and stuff from these villain champion cards, not from the normal champion cards when you play solo. And then one final thing before we jump back to my talking head is most of the scenarios, there'll be ways to like gather these victory points here. And you can see these are just like an Ascension. You've got 1 point and 5 points, but it's really going to depend on the scenario. And I want to just give you a good kind of show and tell of this. Now, as I said before at the beginning, it's kind of hard to tell you how many scenarios are in here because looks like there's about 12 here. And these are just straight like PvP scenarios or one-off scenarios that you can play solo. And you can play these 1, 2, and 3, 4 players. But some are only for 2 players. Some are for all the player counts and stuff like that. So there's a bunch there. And then there's this campaign here, but it's a branching campaign based again on the faction that you choose. So you can definitely play through this a few times with some different setups. And there's a little kind of story elements and choices to make in between some of the scenarios there. So there's a lot going on with this scenario book. So let's go ahead and jump back to my talking head. Okay, so that is Ascension Tactics. Let's go through my 3 pillars of review. We'll talk about player count. Now I've played this 1, 2, and 3 player. I've not played it 4 player yet. And I really enjoyed it at all the player counts. I think by a significant margin, 2 player is my favorite. And that's probably not surprising because I think that's the best way to play normal Ascension. There's just something about that back and forth with the deck building, with the tactical positioning and all that kind of stuff. It just really sings at the 2 player count. Now I have enjoyed it single player. The campaign is really cool. It's really fun. I think that's probably my second favorite player count is single player. It kind of starts off easy, the campaign does, but then it really ramps up and it is actually pretty difficult to win sometimes. And sometimes that sort of solo player AI deck for the villains will just beat you, and there's not really, I could just not be very good at it, but it also feels like, okay, there was no way I was going to win that one based on how the way the cards come out. But then there are times where it's like, oh, I could have seen how I did this differently, and then I'll work out a little strategy, and then I'll be able to beat it, although barely. So I think it's really well. I think if you get this just to play solo, I think it will be pretty rewarding. And they have mentioned on at least the Board Game Geek forums about coming out with some additional solo campaign scenario stuff as well. So it's really well done. I was really surprised that that was as fun as it was. Like I said, it's second place behind 2 player. 2 player is just really good. Like it just flows so smoothly back and forth, and just the competitive juices just get going with that. Now 3 player is fine. Like it's still fun, but it kind of suffered from that just 3 player dynamic, which a lot of games just automatically kind of suffer for. Or like maybe I'm attacking Billy and Francesca's kind of getting away with, controlling the objectives, and, vice versa. And so that kind of dynamic can happen. So it's still fun though. Like if somebody said, let's play a 3 player, like I really enjoy the game, not to bury the lead. So if somebody said, let's play a 3 player, I'd be like, yeah, sure, let's do it. I'd be more than excited to play it. But again, 1 and 2 player is really where I think the game excels, and I haven't played it at 4. Now in terms of player time, it's about an hour maybe per game. It kind of depends. It can go quicker than that, that's for sure. Especially when you kind of get to know the cards, because there's a lot of different cards in the deck. It's a huge deck. And I think there's like 2 copies of each card or something like that. And some of them there's only 1 copy of. So there is a lot of variety in the deck. And the games will play out somewhat differently from that strategic kind of deck building perspective. So once you kind of get to know the cards though, the game should take you about 45 minutes, like with a 2 player game or a solo game even, maybe even a little bit quicker, because the game is really, really snappy. And that's one thing that it does, and I'll kind of move into my last sort of pillar, what is this game kind of like? It retains that Ascension feel. I mean, not only is your starting deck the same, you've got the Mystics, Heavy Infantry, and Cultist, you've got Constructs and Heroes, monsters, and just everything really unwinds in that very snappy, quick, set it up and go. You can play 2, 3, 4 games in a row of this very easily. And you want, for me, I want to, like when we set up and knock it out, I'm like, yeah, let's play again, let's go again, let's go again. And that's kind of how that Ascension game worked for me, way back when. It was like just so easy to set up and knock out. It's not like playing Magic the Gathering or something. It's like, let's shuffle up, do it again, let's do it again. And best out of 3, that kind of thing. So this maintains that. But for me, the instant comparison is to Ascension, but I think for me, this is I'd rather play this. If you said you'd rather play Ascension or this, I 9 times out of 10 or 8 times out of 10, I'd rather play this. Granted, the Ascension app is really cool, and so you can play it on the app, like 40 games in a row or something. And the Ascension is much more portable and stuff like that. So if you threw in a couple of expansions for Ascension, it's easy to just break that out, shuffle, and go in a small table space. So you still retain that. But for me, if I had all my druthers and no other sort of other circumstances, I would much rather set this up and play this, because to me, it's just, I don't know, it's a lot more interesting to spend my power, other than, getting little combos and monster points and all that stuff, which is still really fun. But to set that up and activate all of these figures in this tactical way, and positioning and interacting with the different scenario objectives, it's just a much more satisfying, experience for me. But it's still really quick and still really snappy and still feels very, very satisfying to play. And one of these things with these deck building games, it's like this, it's almost like Pavlov's dog, if you've ever heard of that, where you kind of ring the bell and the dog gets a treat, where the game just kind of gives you a gift like every minute, every like 2 minutes, because of the whole cycle of the deck building and that kind of thing. So it's like, ooh, combo, my new hand, this is the combo, this is what I can do. It gives you a quick little puzzle to solve, and you can get it, and then it hits you again and again and again. And Ascension does that really well, like probably better than most deck building games. Obviously Dominion was the first, and there's a lot of other good deck building games out there that do that. But Ascension, something about that game, that cycle of like the game kind of giving you those little gifts, every like 60 to 90 seconds is really cool. And this retains that. But again, it has that extra little layer of satisfaction with the positioning, the tactics, and the combat, and all that stuff. And all of that really works. So just kind of pivot the conversation a little bit, talking about all the scenarios and the varying objectives and all that stuff. That's really neat. I will say you probably will sort of quickly wear on the first scenario. And I think it may even be an official variant at this point, because that first scenario was like maybe a little too quick. Because in the first one, you just basically control these 3 objectives, and the first one, I think the 30 points wins. That's really fast, and it's a good introductory scenario. I would recommend playing that, because you'll get the kind of vibe and the cadence of everything. But definitely move into some of the other scenarios, or play the variant of the first scenario where I think you play to 40 or 45 points. It just gives you those couple of extra rounds to get your deck kind of going a little bit better, because it can end, you're like, well, before I really got to do anything, the game was over. And so as an intro scenario, that's fine. No big deal. It gets you going, it learns how to play the game. But I would say don't like bank your whole impression of the game on that intro scenario, because it really is just kind of an intro scenario in my opinion. And check the Board Game Geek forums, and maybe there's a Discord or something for this that I know there is, but I just haven't been on it lately. For the sort of the official variant of how many points to play to in that first one. I think it's 45, I don't remember. But you can do whatever you want. I mean, you can play to 50 points. It's the smallest rule tweak there is. You can play to 100 points if you want, get this huge deck. But I do recommend moving on to those other scenarios. There's some really cool things where you have to like get your figures to one side of the board, where the other team is like scoring points, but you're not scoring any points at all until you get to the other side of the board, and then you score like instantly 50 points, theoretically, and then you win the game. And there's other ones that's like an escort one, where you have to escort this like broken down mechanic construct, and you have to like carving up the landscape as you move through there. There's a couple other ones, I'm just having a brain fart. There's a bunch of different ones, like they're really different, and it's really neat to do. And the whole like swath of solo, I should say solo/co-op, because you can play all of that solo stuff as co-op as 2 players, which I've not tried yet. Basically, you ramp up the difficulty of everything, and there's some other very small rules tweaks there. But you play through the same thing. But all of those kind of little puzzles and stuff with those solo/co-op scenarios are really neat as well. So they've really kind of explored the space here, it feels like, with all of that stuff. And it's just nice because you have this really quick and buttery deck building thing, but then you've got this little tactical puzzle off to the side, and they just really work well together. The last thing I would say about here is probably the main other difference between this and Ascension is the treasure tokens. That's a neat kind of thing there. And it's so simple because you just give you like little attack and defense bonuses and move bonuses and stuff like that. But just having those and having those hidden makes players kind of go over the top, just because you might have that, like, +4 defense or whatever it is. So you're like, well, I can't just, hit the guy. I've got to go over and above that. Or maybe it's like, well, all I can really do is maybe I'll try to hit the guy thinking he probably has a defense, but maybe not. Maybe it's like a move token. So that kind of second guessing sort of aspect of the game really adds to it. Because I think if there was none of that, the combat would just obviously be so dry without that. But having that in there and having that sort of double bluff, double guess, type of thing is really, really cool. Makes it actually more engaging and stuff like that. And that's one of the aspects of the game that when you start off, really, you probably go and gather a few treasure tokens. And then it's also a matter of like, when do I actually spend that? I'm like, okay, I have the defensive token. Do I really want to spend it now to save this character? Because I probably should save it for something really important later on. So that layer of that has that little bit of interactive gameplay that doesn't come through these deck building games very often. Having that back and forth head-to-head interaction, even though, like, let's say the original Ascension and Dominion and stuff, they're very kind of competitive, but there's not really a lot of direct interaction. And so obviously the characters and moving around the board and controlling objectives is directly interactive, but it really kind of comes to a head with those treasure tokens and having that sort of mind game kind of come into play. So really, I can't recommend this game enough. Honestly, in my opinion, if money was, no object, I would wait and get the one with the miniatures, because I think the miniatures are really good. Like, I was really surprised because, this is a company that's really just made Ascension and some other, smaller games without really much, I don't think any miniatures ever. And these are great. These sculpts are great. I mean, these are not like high quality Fantasy Flight, Games Workshop, Cool Mini or not miniatures, but they're really good. Like, they're really, really good. I cannot wait to paint these. And the thing that they have for them is they are so, like, uniquely characterful. Trying to come up with the right word. Like, they look different. They look like they belong to the Ascension universe. They don't look like fantasy derivative stuff. Like, I'm like, oh, these are all of these characters that we've seen in Ascension for so long. Like this guy, this Arha guy, you can't see him here, but go look online for these miniatures. This guy's riding like this Asian dragon, and he's like sitting on the head with these antlers, and there's like the robotic dragon, there's Samael the demon. I kind of showed you some of them through the walkthrough, but they have such character to them. I really love them. I do. And so that's good. So, I mean, if you want to just really get in and get the gameplay, I don't know that they'll do this. Maybe they'll do like a miniatures only thing. So if you bought retail, you could upgrade it later with the miniatures. I mean, I kind of hope they do that. I'm not sure if they will. And I don't know what the retail is going to be. The standees, I think, would be fine. Really, I mean, I'm a miniature guy. I like to paint them. But if you don't like to do that, you don't really care about miniatures, I just wish the standees were more than just a square. Because that just is like, ugh. It's okay. I mean, if it doesn't bother you, then fine. I mean, the gameplay is great. I would definitely recommend it for the gameplay alone. Maybe there will be an upgraded version with, like, more differently shaped standee cardboard cutouts. I don't know. That was my only real kind of gripe with the game at all, honestly, was those. And I really have no position to gripe because I got the miniature one. So everything else is really great. It's definitely kind of a new kind of breath of fresh air in kind of the deck building space, which has just been sort of dormant for a while, honestly. And it's right in that kind of same vibe of like Warhammer Underworlds, which is a miniature game, which is sort of like playing, Warhammer Underworlds is kind of like playing Magic the Gathering with miniatures. But that is like a ecosystem thing where you've got to like get expansions and all this stuff. Like, you can just get kind of crazy out of hand. I mean, I'm a person that's been into that. This is great because there's so much in the box, like just a one box purchase, which is just really cool. And that's another reason I would definitely recommend when they come out with the other Kickstarter is get that one, because you're going to be looking at like $100 and some. I don't know exactly how much, but you do get like a wealth of gameplay in here. I mean, the miniatures are great, but you're going to get all of those different scenarios and all that stuff. Who knows what the second Kickstarter is going to have. But really take a good close look at this one, because there's just a good depth and breadth of gameplay in this, especially if you like a fast-paced deck building game, but you want something a little kind of different there. All right, I talked enough. Take a look at it. Thanks.